I'm Jonathan Tompkin from the University of Illinois. Today, most Arab countries buy half of what they eat from abroad. Between 2007 and 2010, cereal imports to the region grew by 13% to 66 million tonnes. Because they import so much, Arab countries are very sensitive to the price of food. In 2007-2008, food prices spiked, with some staple crops doubling in price. In Egypt, local food prices rose 37% between 2008 and 2010. This is important because in a lot of these countries, people depend on cheap food to survive. So this spike in food caused riots in many places around the region, bread riots. Bahrain, Yemen, Jordan, Egypt and Morocco saw food riots in 2008. They all suffered political uprising a few years later, and so many experts think that the Arab Spring came about in part because of concern about food prices. High food prices have long been associated with civil unrest. Given this situation and the fact that we need to produce more food in the future, it might be that we'll see a future filled with food riots. If we can't produce enough food, then more people will be going hungry around the world. Food prices have been increasing over the last few years somewhat, as you can see in this figure. Relative food prices versus time, we can see that food prices today are a little bit higher than they were in the last 10 and 20 years. It's been suggested that we in fact have to increase agricultural production by about 1.5% per year in the coming decades. Given that population is only increasing by around 1% and that rate itself is decreasing over time, why might we need such a big jump in agricultural production? The reason is because as individuals become wealthier, as the world has been doing in the last few decades, the pattern of food consumption changes. In this case, we can compare various nominal features about food, for example its quality, the total amount gets spent, the sorts of calories that gets consumed, versus how wealthy we are. So if we're poor or a middle income person or a rich person, we'll have a different pattern of food consumption. When I use the word we, I mean more than just the United States. It's been shown that in many cultures and many countries, that as these countries become richer and more developed, their pattern of food use changes. So the richer we are, for example, the higher the quality of the food we eat. And quality can mean lots of things, but an example you might think about is freshness. We can afford to have fresh fish flown in, or we can afford to have food that doesn't come out of a can, or so on, right? So we can think about food quality improving. We're going to look at some other factors as well, and if you can, you might like to sketch this graph as we go along. What path do you think that total food expenditure, total calories, and the total starch calories, such as from cereals and potatoes, will take as we go from being poor to middle to rich? Total food expenditure goes up. Richer people have more money to spend, and so they spend some of that money on food. Nothing surprising there. Calories also increase, but they tend to flatten out. We can only eat so much. Once you've met your needs for the day, you don't tend to eat that much more. Calorie waste does go up, however, and in rich countries, a lot of food simply gets thrown out because we're so wealthy, it's not worth our bother to try and conserve some leftovers in the fridge, for example. Estimates vary, but some suggest that around 1/4 of all food calories in Western nations is wasted. If you're rich, however, you eat less starch. You eat less rice, wheat, sorghum, potatoes. Africans, who eat around 144 kilograms per person per year, and Asians, about 179 kilograms per person per year, consume more cereal than Europeans, 133 kilograms per person per year, and North and Central Americans, 127 kilograms per person per year. So as we get richer, we consume less starch, even though we're consuming maybe more calories. That means that we have to consume more things like protein and fat. But even as direct grain consumption decreases, the total amount of grain required increases as we get wealthier. So as people get wealthier, they consume less cereal directly, but more cereal indirectly. This additional cereal is used as feed for animals, which are then consumed. So for example, to produce a chicken, we need to have twice as much calories produced in the form of cereal as we get from eating the chicken itself. The trade-off for pork and beef is even worse. We need 5 calories of cereal for every calorie of pork meat produced, and 8 calories of cereal for every calorie of beef produced. So even though the consumption of cereal is decreasing in richer countries, the total amount of cereal needed is increasing. So as people get wealthier around the world and this pattern spreads to places like Asia and Africa, we can expect that cereal consumption will decrease, but the cereal needs will increase. So the amount of cereal produced will have to keep going up. So far, so good. Over the last few years, cereal production has managed to meet the consumption needs, and in fact, worldwide stocks of cereal have not really decreased over the last decade. This has been made possible through advances in farming. Some experts think, though, that this steady increase in crop output might be difficult to sustain in the coming decades. Let's find out if we can feed the additional 2 billion people we expect by mid-century. We'll look at that in the next lecture.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.